All right, welcome back, everybody. We are on our final lecture of the day, and we're going to get a view of overall World's Fairs in general to kind of help us understand. Now that we've kind of been very detail oriented on the local World's Fairs, but really kind of how World's Fairs came up and how we saw the major decline of World's Fairs. Kind of New Orleans World's Fairs is kind of the beginning. I'm not speaking the word is a part of the decline of World's Fairs. I think that's more important. Is part of a decline. So our next speaker is Grant Wong. He is finishing up his PhD at the University of South Carolina, and we're excited to be bringing him today. And he's an expert on 20th century American popular culture and consumerism. So this is right up his alley. So Grant, I want to welcome you here today, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jason, and putting this all together. And thank you all to the five wonderful speakers who came before me. You all are going to be a tough act to follow, but I'll try my best. Anyway, yes, the rise and fall of World's Fairs. I want to start out by saying that the title of this talk, "The Rise and Fall of World's Fairs," isn't quite accurate. It's a bit of a lie, actually, right? From our perspective, what we in the United States call World's Fairs appear to be a thing of the past. After all, the last World's Fair hosted in the United States was the 1984 Louisiana World Exposition, hosted in New Orleans, which was nearly 40 years ago. It's far enough in the past that, at this point, for the Friends of the Cabildo to host the symposium in commemoration of it. But the truth is that World's Fairs are alive and well. It's just that the United States hasn't been hosting them. Expo 2010, a World's Fair hosted in Shanghai, welcomed over 73 million visitors to the largest world fairgrounds ever, spanning a staggering 1,290 acres. Expo 2020, shown here as well, hosted in Dubai, hosted more than 24 million visitors over its 6-month run, even after being delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, given that World's Fairs are still alive and well, this talk is really about the rise and fall of World's Fairs in the United States. Why doesn't the US host World's Fairs anymore? This is the central question I'll be answering here, and I'll spoil the ending a little bit by saying that it's because the US government and the American public simply don't see them as worthy of investment. World's Fairs are a lot like the Olympic Games. They're magnificent, awesome events, right, in the truest sense of the word, that confer a great deal of prestige and goodwill towards their host countries, but they're also highly expensive endeavors that require a lot of motivation and expertise to get off the ground. People tend to host World's Fairs when they're invested enough in the political, cultural, and diplomatic prestige they confer to be willing to pay for and organize them. This just hasn't been the case in the United States since the Cold War. As such, knowing exactly why the US doesn't see the World's Fairs as worthy of investment is the key to figuring out why they don't happen in this country anymore. But in order to truly understand how we got to this point, we need to look at the past, understanding how World's Fairs came to be, how they've traditionally worked, and how they've evolved in order to get a sense of how we've gotten here. We can certainly explain the lack of World's Fairs in recent years in terms of recent developments, but speaking as a historian, we wouldn't be getting the full picture. But first, we need to define exactly what a World's Fair is. I realize we've been talking all day about World's Fairs, but really precisely understanding what they are and how they function is important to knowing why people host them in the first place. World's Fairs, better known outside of the US as international or universal expositions, or simply expos, are large multicultural exhibitions showcasing the latest and greatest achievements of their host countries. Typically featuring monumental architecture, showcases highlighting the latest technologies, curiosities from around the world, fine arts, and you get this a bit later on in the history of World's Fairs, right? But an entertainment zone with rides, food, and drink. World's fairs were and are means by which participating countries demonstrate their greatness. They're intended to both glorify the countries that represented them and teach visitors about the world. It's no coincidence that early World's fairs were often described as world's universities. In the US, they've often been kickstarted by the wealthy, assisted by local and federal government, as well as corporations intent on advertising their latest innovations. If this all sounds to you like an exercise in self congratulation, you'd be right. As World's Fair historian Robert Rydell puts it, quote, World's fairs are generally part of a reaction to social dislocation, political upheaval, and deep anxiety about the future. As such, countries that host world fairs tend to be countries that have something to prove and have governments or wealthy individuals willing to cover the tremendous costs of financing and organizing them. So, the very first World's Fair, hosted in London in 1851, the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, is a case in point. If there was a country with something to prove in 1851, it was Great Britain, the head of the British Empire. The fair was an opportunity for Britain to show the world the power it wielded, whether in the form of its industrial might or the global reach it enjoyed as a leading imperialist power. So, what made the 1851 exposition the first World's Fair, right? There had been fairs up to this point, right? But the sheer scale of this fair kind of made it stand apart, as well as its kind of jingoist intent. The fair was held in the Crystal Palace, shown here to the left, which was a giant glass and iron exposition hall constructed for the occasion. It occupied about 990,000 square feet and hosted over 8 miles of displays on its ground floors and galleries. The magnificence of the Crystal Palace would set a precedent for all future World's Fairs, setting a standard for their monumental architecture. These structures might be a bit more familiar. Iconic structures such as Paris's Eiffel Tower, Seattle's Space Needle, and New York's Unisphere were all products of World's Fairs. What the palace contained would also define the character of future World's Fairs, as it demonstrated the technological might of the empire. Such attractions included electric telegraphs, microscopes, a prototype fax machine, a revolving lighthouse light, and even an early submarine. Most World's Fairs, following London's example, would emphasize cutting-edge technology and its potential to shape the world. But as the exposition showcased the British Empire, it also displayed objects that emphasized Britain's global supremacy, such as sugarcane from the Caribbean and the Indian Koh-i-Noor diamond, the world's largest at the time. Subsequent World's Fairs would continue this trend, using the spoils of colonialism to reinforce racist concepts of Western and white supremacy. Many hosted what we would today call human zoos, exhibits where people of color were presented as exotic objects to be gawked at. And it wasn't just Europe. The US also embraced this trend. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair showcased over 1,100 Filipinos in recognition of the US's annexation of the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. So, as splendid as they were, World's Fairs were definitively products of their times, for good and for ill, right? These are particular visions of national greatness, not necessarily inclusive ones. So, just to reiterate, World's Fairs are hosted by countries with something to prove, and their displays, whether they be of architecture, technology, empire, or entertainment, are always intended to awe and amaze visitors. And because they're products of their times, it's helpful to think about World's Fairs as responses to their historical moments, particularly moments of crisis. As fairs are often celebrations of imperial or national greatness, exhibitors design them with the intention of assuring visitors of the power and endurance of their countries, or even their host cities. It's no coincidence that the grandest American World's Fairs were hosted in the wake of major crises. The very first World's Fairs in the United States, the likes of Philadelphia's Centennial Exposition in 1876 and the Chicago World Columbian Exposition in 1893, posters of these fairs shown here, were held in the wake of the American Civil War, a conflict that split the country in half and claimed over 700,000 lives, right? I mean, just look at the publicity for this stuff. You have Columbia, right, the feminine symbol of America, right, as a guiding light to the world, right? Then, in the period surrounding the World Wars, you get fairs like the 1933 Century of Progress exhibition in Chicago and the 1939 New York World's Fair. Remember, this was a time of global conflict and worldwide depression. The US had something to prove by hosting these fairs. As the history of these exhibitions demonstrates, they were held not in spite of, but because of the uncertainty of their times. And looking at the respective successes and failures of Cold War era World's Fairs, namely Seattle 1962 and New York 1964, we see that exhibitions in this period were driven by the US's rivalry with the Soviet Union and its need to assert itself on the world stage. By examining these six fairs and what they represented, we can get a sense of how they've historically worked and changed over time, and in turn get a working understanding of why the US doesn't host World's Fairs anymore, at least for now. Right? So there's something to learn from this greatest hits compilation. So, the first US hosted World's Fair that really lived up to the characteristic grandeur and popularity of European World's Fairs was the Centennial International Exhibition of 1876, hosted in Philadelphia. There'd been a prior effort to host a World's Fair in New York, the New York Crystal Palace Exposition, but years right before the Civil War, not a good time to do a fair, kind of crashed and burned, so we often refer to this as the first one. But note the year and place it was hosted. 1876, Philadelphia. In the wake of a horrible civil conflict, the Civil War, as well as the economic fallout of the Panic of 1873, this fair was a means for corporate leaders and government officials to restore Americans' faith in the country. And what better way to do so than host a fair commemorating the country's 100th birthday in a city crucial to the American Revolution? Former Pennsylvania Governor and Senator William Bigler certainly thought so. He argued that a fair would allow visitors to learn of America's, quote, crowning glory, that the mass of the people, whilst engaged in their daily and necessary pursuits, enjoy a larger measure of personal comforts and dignity to those of any other nation. In other words, a successful fair would demonstrate America's greatness and superiority, right? Let's show off how great America is. Let's show them in a medium that Europe has proven to be successful. And a successful fair it was. The Centennial International Exhibition ran for 6 months and attracted almost 10 million paid visitors at the time when the total population of the US was 46 million. That's a pretty good turnout, proportionally, of course. Its architectural and technological grandeur went far beyond the standards set by London. The first World's Fair had fit entirely within the Crystal Palace, which was a magnificent structure, but the centerpiece of the Centennial, shown here, the main building, was the largest building in the world at 1,880 feet long by 464 feet wide, and it was but one of the fair's 5 exhibition buildings. This is to say nothing of the rest. State buildings, restaurants, cigar pavilions, popcorn stands, beer gardens. There was a lot to see and do at the World's Fair. In Philadelphia in 1876, you could watch the massive Corliss engine, the largest steam engine ever built, as it powered the fair's exhibits. We even have an interesting primary source account of poet Walt Whitman coming to the World's Fair, pulling up a chair, plopping it down in front of the Corliss engine, and just watching it in amazement for half an hour, right? This thing was big. You can see the hand and torch of the Statue of Liberty, as Dr. Chamberlain alluded to earlier, then a work in progress. You can witness the first ever public demonstration of Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. You can taste the first commercially branded root beer, courtesy of Hires. The Centennial Exposition, as a whole, operated as all World's Fairs did. It was a celebration of its host country, the United States, and was an optimistic, forward-looking showcase of architecture and technology, right? As much as these fairs were an exercise in self-congratulation, right? They're world's universities. You come here to learn what's going on. You see the Corliss engine. You see the Statue of Liberty. You see Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. Cutting edge of technology. The success of the Centennial kicked off a wave of World's Fairs for the next 40 years, including Louisiana's 1884 World Cotton Centennial, a fair you all know pretty well at this point. But the greatest of these was Chicago's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. This fair is going to be pretty familiar to anyone here who's read Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City. Note again the year and place of the World's Fair. The year, 1893. The fair opened a year later than planned, right? Delays and such. But as the World's Columbian Exposition, it celebrated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's landing in the New World. The place, Chicago. The fair was a means by which Chicago could demonstrate its greatness to the US and to the world, and it was also an opportunity for the city to recuperate from the Great Fire it suffered in 1871, as well as the 1886 Haymarket Massacre, a violent clash between labor protesters and the police. More specifically, the fair was Chicago's way of demonstrating what it could do to the East Coast. Up to this point, the city was a bit of a backwater, especially when compared to New York. Just as the Centennial Exposition had topped the Crystal Palace Exposition, the Chicago Fair was greater than its predecessor, as well as its rival, the 1889 Paris Exposition, which had occasioned the construction of the Eiffel Tower. It's not for nothing the fair's exhibition buildings, shown here, were known as the White City, as these massive neoclassical buildings were a sight to behold. Right. I mentioned how important architecture is to the fairs, right? From the buildings you see here, these kind of reflected the emergent City Beautiful movement at the time, right? An emphasis on massive, awe-inspiring structures, symmetrical, right? Very, very big, very grand, right? And as one writer recounted in the New York Daily Tribune, quote, "The wonderful group of buildings with their marvelous beautiful surroundings of land and water, created as if by magic, cannot adequately be described or portrayed by either pen or pencil. The most beautiful and remarkable collection of architectural monuments that this world has ever witnessed." The White City even lit up at night with electric lighting at a time when most Americans were unfamiliar with it. Right? Imagine what that must have been like, going to Chicago, seeing all of these white neoclassical buildings, right, that hadn't been there prior, right, and seeing the whole thing light up at night. Must have been incredible. The exposition also boasted its own answer to the Eiffel Tower, the very first Ferris wheel. But also intertwined with the fair's appeal to architectural and technological superiority was racial superiority. Its anthropological exhibits included a Dahomean village, a display of so-called primitive Africans, as well as a laboratory where visitors could measure themselves against idealized statues of Anglo-Saxon men and women. The World's Columbian Exposition, in many ways, was the quintessential World's Fair. It was an exhibition that demonstrated American greatness, or rather, a particular vision of white American greatness. But, right, in the wake of the Civil War, the US had to prove itself to the world. The World's Fairs were its means of doing so. Skipping ahead to the 1930s and 1940s, the US continued to host World's Fairs as the success of the Centennial and the World's Columbian Exposition ensured that the US would continue to host these events. Even the Great Depression did not stop them. In fact, Chicago's 1933 Century of Progress exhibition and New York's 1939 World's Fair were responses to the Depression. They were reassurances to the American public that the US would persevere through hard times. In fact, it's worth noting that World's Fairs actually hit a bit of a slump in the prosperous 1920s. Chicago 1933 and New York 1939 were tremendous successes because they were effective responses to crisis. Chicago's Century of Progress exhibition was itself a celebration of the World's Fair medium. Its year, 1933, was both a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the city's founding and the 40th anniversary of the World Columbian Exposition, right? That fair went super well. This fair is being held in commemoration of that fair. And in its intended form, it was certainly a World's Fair. It was a response to a crisis and a demonstration of American ingenuity. But it was also a reflection of its particular moment. World's fairs had changed with their times. In contrast to the traditional and neoclassical architecture of the Centennial and World Columbian Exposition, the Century of Progress embraced modernism, a stripped down style that embodied innovation and speed. This new approach went hand in hand with the fair's emphasis on technology and business, as the world's fairs increasingly looked more to the future than to the past and attracted greater corporate involvement. The fair's unofficial model kind of says it all. Science finds, industry applies, man conforms. So you see here two kind of stellar examples of the new direction that fairs in this period were taking. We see here a very futuristic, kind of cool looking building, the Travel and Transport Building. What you see here, this was a series of like steel towers. You're gonna see like little wires extending from the towers. These were supporting a dome that covered the whole thing, and the dome was designed to contract and expand with the weather. Right, the wires were the main supports. It was like It was like if a suspension bridge was a building. But you also have here the House of Tomorrow, a utopian home designed to speculate as to what a home of the future might look like. And the house was pretty on the house was prophetic. It was pretty correct when it came to some innovations. It included utilities like central air conditioning, um, the first General Electric dishwasher, and an attached garage that opened at the push of a button. Right, innovations we use today in 2023. However, the family airplane hangar included in the House of Tomorrow never quite caught on. Of course, remember that this fair was held in the middle of the Great Depression. It certainly would have meant a lot to visitors to the House of Tomorrow that there would be a tomorrow, and a comfortable capitalist one at that. Chicago's success paved the way for the 1939 New York World's Fair, which reiterated Chicago's forward-looking optimism and faith in technology. As the fair's official pamphlet read, quote, "The eyes of the fair are on the future, not in the sense of peering towards the unknown, nor attempting to foretell the events of tomorrow and the shape of things to come, but in the sense of presenting a new and clearer view of today in preparation for tomorrow." Promoted as the World of Tomorrow, the fair attracted over 40 million visitors. And like the Century of Progress, the New York Fair was a response to the Great Depression, designed to reassure the American public. The fair's central monuments, shown here, the modern-ish Trilon and Perisphere, right? The Trilon's the big Washington monument-looking structure, the Perisphere is the big ball, impressed visitors as they flocked to them and through them, right? You can go inside these things. The Perisphere hosted a diorama called Democracy, where spectators could look down from balconies upon a dazzling diorama of a utopian city. Corporations flocked to the fair, using their pavilions to showcase their latest technologies and visions of the future. Westinghouse presented Electro, a 7-foot tall humanoid robot that could tell jokes, blow up balloons, and smoke cigarettes. General Motors constructed a 35,000 square foot Futurama exhibit, a ride that carried visitors through a model city for a third of a mile. The Radio Corporation of America, RCA, showcased a little niche invention called the television, introducing it to the American public for the very first time. In fact, the very first television programming offered by RCA's subsidiary, NBC, began with footage of President Franklin Roosevelt's speech opening the fair. In the midst of the Great Depression, the optimism and futurism of the 1939 New York World's Fair reassured Americans that there was nothing to fear but fear itself. The fair even continued on into 1940 as the Second World War broke out in Europe. It embraced a new theme for peace and freedom. Following the end of World War II, the US did not host another World's Fair until Seattle, 1962. It's likely that the country was preoccupied with reconstructing the world and adjusting back to civilian life, but another crisis ushered in a new era of World's Fairs, the Cold War. The Soviet Union's successful launch of Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, prompted the US to host the Century 21 Exposition, a space age themed World's Fair in the urban heart of Washington state. In fact, the fair's planners, who were kind of right local leaders and businessmen in Seattle, they'd originally planned this as a regional fair to commemorate a World's Fair that had been hosted in Seattle in the past. But the US's rivalry with the USSR got them thinking, hey, maybe we can make a World's Fair out of this, right? Very telling. Crisis happens, World's Fair happens. Just as Chicago and New York had assured a weary nation that the Depression would end, Seattle 1962 declared that the US would win the Cold War. The fair showcases spotlighted a glorious Cold War era vision of what the US and the world might look like after embracing space age technology. At Century 21, the fair's motto, Living in the Space Age, was evident in its emblem, shown here, the 605-foot tall Space Needle. As fair attendee Newt Berger recalled, quote, it was as if a spaceship from a friendly future had landed in our own backyard. With a dizzying height, narrow frame, and flying saucer-shaped observation deck, the Needle appeared poised to shoot into the stratosphere, visually assuring visitors that the US would prevail in the space race. Other modern marvels, like the Seattle Center monorail and the Bubbleator, a large bubble-shaped hydraulic elevator, kept visitors impressed with the fair's futurism while transporting them throughout the exposition. The federal government's investment in the fair went primarily towards the construction of a 6-acre US science pavilion. Dedicated to both educating and enthralling visitors, the pavilion hosted a planetarium that simulated a trip to outer space, as well as its own answer to Sputnik Friendship 7, shown here, the capsule that carried astronaut John Glenn on the US's first orbital spaceflight in 1961. There's some very fun newspaper articles from the time that talk about how it was a highlight of a lot of visitors to Seattle to just touch Friendship 7. You see here, this person is touching it, right? And there's even a fun article about from, I think it was either the Seattle Times or the Post Intelligencer, where these kids are like chasing after John Glenn, trying to give him a handshake, right? Come to the fair, touch Friendship 7, touch John Glenn, right? But taken together, these features of Century 21 celebrated a particularly American understanding of the world, premised upon the mastery the US enjoyed over all things architectural, technological, commercial, and cultural. Now, I'll fully admit I have a bit of a soft spot for the Seattle World's Fair. This is kind of where my World's Fair research got started. So I wanted to show you all a very kind of fun video just depicting the World's Fair. I will note that this is a very idealized image of it, right? This was basically a commercial for Bell Telephone, which later became AT&T, right? But, you know, as much as this thing is an advertisement, it gives us a sense of just the energy surrounding the fair, what it was like to attend it, right? So let's take a look for a little bit. Step back into the past. Right. So we don't need to quite watch the whole thing. It kind of ends in an extended advertisement for Bell Telephone Company's newfangled push button telephone, right? But you see a lot of elements here that made the World's Fair attractive, right? You get the American greatness in the architecture, in the technology, but right in the 20th century, these things in many ways can be proper fun, right? I don't know if we'd have as much fun as these children have. I don't think they're capable of not smiling, right? But we get a sense as to what made the World's Fair special. So moving on to the the 1964 New York World's Fair, follow up to Seattle, was the last World's Fair of its scale in the United States. Its fairgrounds covering over 646 acres. As President Lyndon Johnson remarked at the fair's opening, "This fair represents the most promising of our hopes. This fair shows us what man at his most creative and constructive is capable of doing." Right? So still a very characteristic sense of optimism, grandeur, right? The World's Fairs have changed a lot, but in many ways, you see the medium staying true to certain themes. In New York, 1964 was a grand World's Fair based around the theme of peace through understanding and boasted as its centerpiece the 140-foot tall Unisphere, a monumental stainless steel globe. The wonders of technology were as present as ever. General Motors updated its Futurama exhibit from New York, 1939, offering fairgoers a simulated trip to the moon. The Ford Motor Company unveiled the Ford Mustang, described by Henry Ford as a working man's Thunderbird. And you'll all be able to recognize some of these things coming up, right? Walt Disney designed attractions for the fair for corporate sponsors that would later make it to Disneyland. You'll likely recognize these if you've ever been there. These included It's a Small World, originally for the UNICEF Pavilion, sponsored by Pepsi, the Carousel of Progress, sponsored by General Motors, and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, which featured an animatronic Abraham Lincoln. Disney somehow managed to convince the state of Illinois to fund this, right? However, for all of the grandeur of the fair, in many ways, the 1964 also hinted at the end of World's Fairs in the US. As the brainchild of urban planner Robert Moses, the fair was badly mismanaged and was constantly in the headlines for its financial woes. Right? It's not as if the fairs hadn't lost money before, but this was on a new scale. The over $21 million deficit was too great a cost to bear for this. It didn't help matters that the fair's opening day was targeted by a civil rights movement protest, plaguing it with bad publicity. The fair planners had engaged in some discriminatory hiring practices. And Moses had also snubbed the International Bureau of Expositions, the Paris based governing body of World's Fairs. They had awarded Seattle their sponsorship, and they refused it to New York because Moses didn't meet their stipulations, and it was also too close in terms of time frame. Moses also didn't help his case. He described the bureau as three little men in a hotel room in Paris. So they weren't happy, and they told basically all of their constituent countries to not go to the fair. So as a result, you had, in terms of official representation, you only really had Spain, which was the only country to defy the ban, as well as newly independent countries in Africa and Asia. You still had some countries at the fair through kind of unofficial or private means, right? But the damage was done. After 1964, there would never be another World's Fair on the scale of New York's. So now that we know about the history of American World's Fairs, why doesn't the US host World's Fairs anymore? As I've said, World's Fairs are hosted by countries with something to prove, especially in response to crises. The six fairs we've looked at today were responses to the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Cold War. In this sense, the US hasn't hosted a World's Fair since Louisiana 1984 because it simply hasn't seen the medium as worthy of investment. Following the end of the Cold War, when the US emerged as the world's sole superpower, it became difficult to justify the cost of hosting a grand exposition for the sake of national reassurance and public diplomacy. What more was there to prove to the public? The US had already won. But the word investment is also key here. People often plan World's Fairs knowing they're likely to lose money, or at least, right? If you know the history of World's Fairs at all, these things typically don't make a ton. So there needs to be enough motivation to host a fair despite potential financial losses. There's a certain point where deficits outweigh the benefits of a fair's prestige. The 1964 New York World's Fair was the last of its scale because of the sheer amount of money it lost. And part of why the 1984 Louisiana World's Fair was the US's last was because it went bankrupt, even though it was far smaller. If your country doesn't have as much to prove and doesn't have a government or wealthy individuals willing to foot the bill, you just don't get a World's Fair. But we also need to think back to what makes a World's Fair a World's Fair. Architecture, technology, entertainment. In large part, these foundational aspects of World's Fairs have been adopted by other mediums. Theme parks and the Olympic Games have fulfilled many of the purposes of World's Fairs, replicating the lived sensations and awe-inspiring architecture that made them distinct and exciting. The Disney World theme park Epcot, for instance, is practically a permanent World's Fair, hosting a world showcase of 11 countries and a massive geodesic sphere, which was itself modeled after the product of a World's Fair, the biosphere designed by Buckminster Fuller for Expo 67 in Montreal. And the park's name originally stood for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, clearly echoing the world of tomorrow embodied by the New York World's Fairs and Seattle 1962. And that's to say nothing that it wasn't weird at all for Walt Disney to take rides developed for the 64 World's Fair and to just stuff them into Disneyland. The Olympic Games have also, in many ways, taken on the same functions that World's Fair once embodied, right? As depicted here, the massive bird's nest Beijing National Stadium from the 2008 Beijing Olympic Summer Games, right? A way for China to bolster its prestige on the world stage. And beyond signaling a shift away from cultural expositions, the Olympics are a sporting event. It's a competition, offering countries a chance to test their mettle against other nations while expressing pride in their history and traditions, right? Very kind of similar function to a World's Fair there. not to mention the architecture, which establishes the tone and vision of a specific games, and they often leave a legacy, much like the World's Fairs did, right? Plus, as televised events go, they're far more exciting to watch, right? Might be better to watch a basketball game than people attending a fair, right? But they're a bit more adaptable to modern media, in my opinion. But right, with the rise of modern media, this has also made the fair's corporate showcases redundant, right? In the past, you'd go to a fair to witness the unveiling of the Ford Mustang or see the cordless engine, push button telephone, the house of tomorrow, um, right? But you're not looking to a World's Fair these days to find out about Apple's latest iPhone. So you may not know that the US actually continues to contribute to World's Fairs, but its participation in recent years has been decidedly lackluster. Case in point, at Expo 2010 in Shanghai, the US pavilion, right? Uh, Not exactly the most inspiring looking building, was designed by a Canadian architect, not an American, and was funded solely by private contributions from corporations, right? As we saw, corporations had been heavily involved in World's Fairs, but usually you had more government involvement. To quote Jose Villarreal, the Commissioner General of the US Pavilion for this fair, quote, when I signed the participation agreement with the expo organizer last July, I made then what was I made what was then viewed as a very audacious statement that we would finish on time and we would raise the funds necessary for US participation at the World Expo. Not exactly a statement of confidence. We're finishing on time and we have enough money, right? There's clearly been a shift in perceptions and investment in World's Fairs. So, where does that leave American World's Fairs? In my opinion, the World's Fair could still stage a comeback in the US. Clearly, there's enough interest in them for this symposium to exist and all you lovely people to attend these talks. But to be successful, they need to adapt to our times and distinguish themselves from rival media. In fact, the US has actually started bidding for World's Fairs again through the International Bureau of Expositions. In 2017, the US made a bid to host Expo 2023 and made another just this year for Minnesota to host Expo 2027. While both bids failed, it's not for nothing that the US has seriously considered bringing the World's Fair back in recent years. The future of the World's Fair in America remains uncertain. But if we know anything about World's Fairs, the uncertainty of the era might actually make its return more likely. While researching World's Fairs, I spoke with historian Robert Rydell to get his take on this, and his answer was so great that I think it's worth quoting in full. So, Dr. Rydell told me, are Americans satisfied with their economy? Are they optimistic about the future? Do they have any anxieties about social justice, about climate change, about nuclear warfare? Or have all of those issues just disappeared? Are Americans basically happy in each other's company? If the answer is yes, then no, there will never be another fair in America. But if the answer is things are still unsettled and people are still anxious to some large degree about where America and the world might be headed, then I would be positively shocked if there isn't another World's Fair in America's future, probably sooner than a lot of people expect. End quote. Looking back to the history of American expositions, time and time again, the US has hosted World's Fairs when it's needed to reassure itself. And given the times we're living in, we very might be due for another one. The next chance the US has to host a fair sanctioned by the International Bureau of Expositions will be in 2032 or 2035. I suggest you all keep an eye on your calendars. Thank you.
Fantastic, Grant. That honestly, unfortunately, every question I have, you basically answered it because you went along there. But I do have some couple more questions. But that was really fascinating to learn all that there. So if anybody has any final questions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to ask them, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do that as well. I want to talk a little bit about the design of world fairs and kind of before it was seen as you build these World's Fairs. It's to show off, wherever you are in the world. Um, but were they ever designed with the idea that of the reuse of space? So like uh, so you might build something in Chicago that you're like immediately we're like we know exactly what it's going to be next or something like that. Has that ever been considered on World's Fairs?
Yep. So oftentimes World's Fairs are kind of kicked off by kind of wealthy local politicians or notables or businessmen in a given city to boost the reputation of that city. But you do have important you do have instances where they're going in very conscious that they want to reuse the structures. Seattle 1962 is an especially successful fair in part because it's very kind of cohesive and self-contained. They had a very clear vision of what they were doing with the buildings and architecture, right? Space Needle is still standing, but that entire complex around the fair, there's a good chunk of it still in use. And even though it never caught on as a form of mass transit, the monorail we saw in that video, that was actually intended as, this is the future of the public transport system in the city. It doesn't catch on, but it is still in operation for tourists if you go to Seattle. And with the New York World's Fair in 1964, as we saw, not the most successful fair. And a lot of it doesn't, there's a good chunk of, they ended up having to demolish a lot of it just due to the financial losses. But the intention was that they would develop that park over in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park, to kind of be like almost like a new Central Park, right? So even though that fair, had to demolish its buildings in part because it was just such a financial disaster, it was made with the intention of just having a wonderful, beautiful park that New York can use.
And would you also say that about the warehouse district in New Orleans? And that's, that is its long-term legacy is that entire neighborhood, which was basically just a bunch of old empty buildings, became Joy Street and the convention center and all of that stuff. I mean, that success of that World Cup is still today showing. Um, doesn't that show that New Orleans the 1984 World's Fair was such a huge boom for New Orleans long term?
Right. Quite frankly, I don't know a ton about the Louisiana World's Fair, so don't quote me on this, right? But of course, given that these World's Fairs are often, revitalization projects for cities as much as they are demonstrations of, national prowess and ingenuity. I don't think it's surprising that, this stuff continues to endure and, it has become part of the city.
Um, when you were talking, you talked about Disneyland and Walt Disney, but I kept thinking about my last visit, which has been a while, but to Epcot. And Epcot just seems like, to an extent, is almost like a World's Fair every single day. I mean,
Mhm.
isn't that I mean, do you think that that was part of Walt Disney's vision was to have that built like a
Yeah,
World's Fair?
I'm not a Disney expert but as far as I'm aware, Epcot kind of has its own weird history where, it ended up as a theme park, but part of it was Walt Disney legit, actually trying to plan out kind of like a futuristic community, right? But
Hmm.
of course, we see the influence of the World's Fairs, right? If you actually see like an image of the biosphere from Expo 67, it's like the Epcot ball. It's a massive, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, some of the intentions were definitely there. Um, but that's another point I make as to right the decline of the World's Fair in the U.S. Right, when World's Fairs started out, kind of this unique combination of technology, architecture, entertainment was a lot more. It felt a lot more new, but eventually, once you get these new mediums, right, the rise of the Olympic Games, amusement parks, right, Coney Island was actually directly inspired by the World's Fairs in its conception, right? The World's Fair kind of loses that uniqueness and it becomes a bit less attractive to host it as its own thing.
Has there ever been, and maybe that's one of the successes of the Olympics, is that they're like every 4 years is going to be a new Olympics and it's going to be in a new place. And, as we've learned today, um, World's Fairs sometimes happen every 2 years, sometimes they happen in the same year. do you think that would be a much more successful model if they went to every 4 years or 6 years instead of every 2 years and then 4 years later? It was a little bit more consistent.
See, I find it very interesting you bring that point up because I think it makes sense and it's a very good question. But I think that just kind of shows the extent to which we in America just
Yeah.
don't really think about World's Fairs as often
Hmm.
because the International Bureau of Expositions actually does control for that. The whole bidding process, part of it is that the Bureau will make sure that there aren't too many World's Fairs going on at a given time so that they can kind of space them out and guarantee there'll be a certain amount of attendance, right? Part of why the 1964 New York bid fails is because they award it to Seattle and then Robert Moses gets mad and decides to host the fair anyway, right? Um, so, right, he was
But he
hosting
just
this
used the
massive.
word World's Fair. It wasn't a completely sanctioned one to an extent, right?
Yeah, yeah. But like Dr. Chamberlain mentioned earlier, right? You don't get the International Bureau until like a few decades after World's Fairs are already being hosted.
Okay.
But right at that point, the Bureau was influential enough to just tell its members, yeah, don't show up to this one. It's not right. Um, so under the Bureau, they do like regularly plan out the years the expositions will be set in, right? So we had the Shanghai exposition, we had the Dubai exposition. Um, so there is a certain regularity to the timing. We in the US just don't know it because we're not keeping track of these things.
Yeah, and I think you pointed that out right in the very beginning when I said the rise in the beginning of the downfall. You were like, well, that's in the U.S. Is it happening? So, I appreciated that because it put my brain into kind of thinking like, okay, I've got to take this out of an American view of it and look at it from a global point of view. Um, the final question is, where do you think will be the next U.S. Um, World's Fair? I mean, where's an actual realistic city that you think? I mean, Minneapolis. Well, I guess it was in Minneapolis in Minnesota. Would be a great place. But what else? What other cities you think would be good for this?
That's a really great question. I honestly have no clue. I don't really, I don't really know enough to answer that with confidence. I really wouldn't be surprised if there was a successful bid that it went to somewhere like, I think it was technically Bloomington, but right, it's still that Twin Cities area because it was actually that Twin Cities area. I think specifically Bloomington that put the bid 2 times in a row. Right, if they keep at it, maybe. But I realize this is a bit of a cop-out answer, right? But I think that any successful city is going to be, right, an up-and-coming one that is willing to invest these resources and use the World's Fair as an opportunity to, right, show off its stuff and revitalize itself, right? So for instance, right, we have the Los Angeles Olympics coming up, right? A city with those kinds of motivations is going to be a city that hosts a World's Fair. Of course, if they win the bid.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, I was thinking of like Miami, but then right when you just gave that definition of what that reasoning would be, somewhere like Charlotte, North Carolina would be something that might be a little bit better because it's just not as it's got a huge base, it's growing a lot, but it also needs to kind of show itself off a little bit. Miami doesn't need to do any of that; they've got everything going on there. So that's a good explanation of which the reasoning what possibly could be the next ones. Well, Grant, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for attending today. It's been a great day of great talks, and we will be getting recordings out early next week of all the lectures. So I hope everybody who didn't get to attend today live will get to watch it later on. And I hope you've learned a lot. I have learned a ton, and I want to thank everybody for participating today, from our speakers to our guest on the Zoom. So, Grant, thank you so much, and we had a great night, great evening with you, everybody. So, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Y'all have a good one.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.